This is the lecture for European history for Friday, the 19th of February 2021. We are now going into a series of regional case studies of the world before and during and after the European conquest in the late 19th century. Remember, these European empires, the British, the French, the German, are different from typical pre-industrial empires, certainly pre-Age of Discovery empires, because these are maritime, not land-based. They are dispersed, not contiguous. They have behind them a genuine imbalance between the technology and sophistication of Western civilization and the relative medievalism, or worse, primitivism, in the other parts of the world in terms of their material technology. Now, the empires were being built, as we talked about, in order to acquire natural resources in some bid for potential autarky. Also, they are built in order to have to afford those imperial powers control over strategic choke points in world trade, and to provide a series of coaling stations for these empires' navies and also merchant ships to use as they travel. At this time, the sea was the great highway of the world. This is before air travel. This is before aircraft were even invented, except for hot air balloons. So, these empires are going to be of a different quality than, say, the Mongols, the Arabs, the Romans, even. They're going to happen much more quickly. And because of circumstances that we'll cover in Unit 4, they're going to fall much more quickly. And there is an interesting question in all of this that is explored in a novel called Something of Value by Robert Ruark. Ruark was familiar with British Kenya, and Something of Value was set during the 1950s Mau Mau uprising, which is an uprising of native African tribes against those Africans who collaborated with the British. And it was a terror campaign also against the British and the white settlers in Kenya to induce them to leave. Militarily, it failed. But when the British government changed its mind about imperial power in the early 1960s, Kenya was one of the first countries to be granted independence. So in the end, the Mau Mau goals, though failing in the field, succeeded politically about a decade later. In Something of Value, which traces this time, Ruark points out that the Europeans are in Kenya just long enough to eclipse and destroy the native balance of society. The various tribes were in balance with one another. Kikuyu and Luo. Luo is President Obama's father's tribe. Versus Maasai, who are sort of the traditional spear hunters and warrior class. And the Kikuyu are the major tribe of the ruling class of Kenya since independence. They tend to be urban, mercantile, and a little more settled as farmers than the Maasai or the Luo or other tribes. So Europe is there long enough to destroy what had been a sort of Paleolithic, Neolithic, hunter-gatherer, early farmer type balance, with occasional contact from Islamic traders and Islamic missionaries. And so the native taboos and the witch doctors and the customs that kept men and women and children mutually responsible and safe and created functional relationships All of these things were disrupted. It's what happens when you have a Stone Age society meet a modern industrial society. The Stone Age society, however proud people may be of their customs, is simply insufficient in terms of its ability to manage people and their problems when compared to an industrial society's ability to do those things. So what happens is the young people tend to gravitate towards the new ways, and the old tend to try to cling to the old ways and try to pass them on. And there is this tension between the natives and among the natives, between traditionalists and modernizers, and this exists all over the world uh, in the face of the European conquests. Some of the natives became very Christian. Kenya still has a very strong set of Christian communities, different denominations, and became modern, became educated. In fact, the leadership class of the Mau Mau and of the political group that ended up taking over Kenya after independence was educated in British schools. They were modern, educated, um, but they were dedicated towards this notion of African nationalism. So the question Ruark asks is, did or can the Europeans provide something of value in place of the old societies which, primitive though they may have been, worked to keep society functioning, to keep relations between men, women, and children relatively healthy and relatively positive? Did the Europeans replace the native traditions with Christianity? Yes, in some cases, semi in others. Did the Europeans replace the native economy of hunting, gathering, and primitive farming with more modern farming techniques? Yes and no. Did the Europeans replace the traditional tribal structure with a more modern structure of a working class, a middle class, and an upper class of owners? The answer there is absolutely not. The tribal system lost a lot of its balance, but kept a lot of its ability to command people's loyalties. And so tribal rivalries still dominate Kenya to this day. And they are the bane of Kenya and of most sub-Saharan African countries. People don't think of themselves as individuals who have beliefs that join political parties because they reflect those beliefs. They think of themselves as Kikuyu or Luo or Maasai or others. So this question of, while the Europeans were there, in the 50 or 60 or 70 years they happened to dominate certain parts of the world, like Africa, in Africa's interior, like like East Asia. South Asia had been dominated for hundreds of years, as the Philippines had been. But like Japan and China and Korea and Vietnam and those areas were under European rule for 50, 60, at most 70 years. In that time, did the Europeans, whose very presence destroyed the old cultures as competitive, provide them with enough indoctrination or education into the new cultures so that something of value could replace the something of value that the presence of Europeans had destroyed? And Ruark's answer was, well, you think about it. Writing or thinking now, 60 or 70 years after Ruark wrote his novel, with the record of sub-Saharan African countries and a lot of Latin American countries and a lot of Asian countries that are considered to be third world, apparently the Europeans were there just long enough to eclipse or destroy, or at least fundamentally damage, the native balance that had existed before their arrival, but not quite long enough to genuinely acculturate these other parts of the world into the particular balances within Western civilization that keep us from going into tyranny or slavery or anarchy. And a lot of these societies are failed states because they're deeply divided by tribe, and they have modern equipment, including modern weapons, modern dental tools, but no sense of the balance of power or the give and take that exists in a European style social democracy or an American style liberal democracy. Um, that balance, that restraint, that morality that holds people's worst impulses in check is often completely absent from the politics of post independence third world countries. That's unpleasant, but it's true. And it is something that is real enough that it requires people who care about these things, and I consider myself one of them, to think long and hard about it. It is not simply enough to say white man bad, brown man good. It is not simply enough to decry imperialism as the cause of all of these countries' problems, because imperialism lasted less time in some cases than the independence of these countries after imperialism. Did imperialism by Europeans disturb the balance? Yes. Were they there long enough to provide something of value? Probably not. But there is a point of diminishing returns beyond which blaming Europeans or Western civilization for the ongoing hell that exists in so many of these countries, diminishing returns as in it doesn't work. The problems that exist are real, the imbalances that exist, and they need to be dealt with thoughtfully. And simply crying racism or reverse racism or cultural imperialism or cultural appropriation is less and less relevant to the fact that in these countries there is an ongoing tension and trauma where you have, in many ways, a failed, stunted form of tribalism that has survived into the modern world in combination with modern surveillance technologies and assault rifles. So, keep these things in mind as you hear about these regional case studies, because everywhere on earth has been transformed by Europe. The question is, after Europe left, to the extent it has, and we're inheritors of Europe, what is going on in those countries? And that will be addressed now, and it will also be addressed during Unit 4 when we talk about anti-colonialism and decolonization. So there's your preamble to the regional case studies, and it went on quite a bit longer than I thought, but there are some, I insist, worthwhile things for you to consider that go beyond the simple narratives that are sold by so many politicians and educators today. We start by looking at China. China is the world's other great civilization. In Eurasia, during ancient times, four great civilizations developed. In the center, you've got the Middle East, which ends up becoming Islamic civilization, and you've got India, which retains certain unique functions. But both of these are hybrid cultures in that the Middle East they're like middle children. Both the Middle East and India take influences and give influences out beyond themselves. At the edges, there are two prime civilizations. The West, which is us, and China, which is in the East. And the cultures in Korea and Japan, in the Philippines to a very limited degree, and Vietnam are all in orbit around this Chinese-based civilization. And they are all fundamentally shaped by it. So we start by looking at the world's other great civilization that is not necessarily a hybrid or a middle child, but that is new. I also must point out that modern Chinese education under the great leader Xi Jinping is beginning to say that the pyramids were and are a fake, and that man evolved and developed in China before it did in Africa or anywhere else, which is nationalistic hokum or bunk in the opinion of mainstream thought. Now, is it possible that the science of our evolving in Africa was wrong? Is it possible that we've missed something? Yeah, sure. Is it certain that Homo erectus came to China in the form of the old Peking man? Yeah, That's very, very likely. Um, but to basically deny that any civilization developed before China is nationalistic hubris. The first civilization on earth was in Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia, in the Basra region of modern Iraq. It was not in the Yangtze and Huanghe river valleys of China. They came along a bit later. And as to the great ancient Chinese civilization that Xi's Communist China often extols, remember that more than anyone else, the Communist Party from 1949 to the present has systematically murdered the language, culture, cultural relics, cultural memory, literature, and people who embody that civilization. And yet they claim to be its heirs. Well, in the middle 1800s, the last time we talked about China was in the early 1600s. There had been contact with the Europeans. Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit missionary, had become an advisor to the Ming court, a mandarin or a shi. And we talked about how the Kiang-Hsi emperor actually considered becoming Roman Catholic until he realized who the Pope was. And he offered the Catholics an opportunity to replace the Pope with the Son of Heaven, and the Catholics refused. So the Kiang-Hsi emperor, the most dynamic emperor of the last dynasty of the Chinese Empire, the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, the Kiang-Hsi emperor basically closed China off and kicked the foreigners out. He thought that they were too destabilizing. Now, this is going to be in parallel with what the Japanese do at almost the exact same time. And the thing about China and Japan, I will remind you, is that both of them were the societies that the Europeans looked at and said, wow, we would love some of that. We would love to be like that to a great degree. Because at point of contact, while the Europeans had a higher degree of naval technology and a slight edge in military technology, in terms of economics, political development, sociology, China and Japan were in advance of where Europe was in the 15 and 1600s, arguably. India was about where Europe was, but India was so divided against itself that it was much more easy for the French and then the British to take over. China and Japan, no, not at all. But the Kiang-Hsi emperor for China closes China off to limit the destabilizing influences of the foreigners on his empire. Once again, China says that the outside world is not our concern. They did the same thing a couple of hundred years before when they destroyed the exploration and treasure fleet of the Admiral Mandarin Cheng Ho, who went out into the Indian Ocean and discovered about 50 years before Columbus that there was nothing there worth, nobody there worth talking to, and nothing there worth having. And the reaction of the Ming emperors of China at that point, the slightly prior dynasty, was to say, well, if there's nothing out there in the world for us to see, let's just imagine it doesn't exist. And that decision came to bite them in the butt when the Europeans showed up on their shores. This is going to happen again. The British are desperate to break into the China trade, to get some of that tea, some of which is going to be transplanted into British India, to get some of that porcelain, to get some of that silk, and to get some of the other resources and cultural artifacts that only China can produce, or that only China produces as well as they do. The problem is the imperial government of China, which has continued its closing to foreigners, refuses to let the British land anywhere and trade. Finally, they agree that the city of Canton, modern Guangzhou, or Guangzhou, in the south of China, can have limited foreign trade, and the Europeans set up what they call factories. What they really are is trading posts and walled-off European communities in the city of Canton. But the Chinese will not accept anything in foreign trade except silver. So whenever the British want to buy other goods, they can't trade cotton for it. The Chinese say they don't need it. They can't trade any of their goods, including finished goods from British factories. The Chinese say they don't need it. And in fact, point of fact, they really don't. They view foreign trade as something that is a unpleasant necessity that can be managed at a small scale, but they are going to vampirically suck as much specie, as much precious metal, which is the basis of their currency, which is silver, as they can, silver, gold, gems, out of the round-eyed barbarians, which is us, people of the West. So the Chinese refuse to trade with Britain on what Britain considers to be fair terms. So the British, in the late 1830s and early 1840s, begin importing something into China that the Chinese government can't stop. They begin importing Afghani and Northwest Indian opium. Now, the thing about opium, the thing that you really need to understand, is that opium is an intensely addictive narcotic drug. Opium is smoked and it induces visions that take a person out of their body into an alternative world, and it's a sensation that once people taste is very hard to say no to again and again. People can lose their life in the opium pipe. It is much more addictive than alcohol. It is much more dangerous than alcohol. It is a truly addictive drug. And the British are going to import it and sell it to Chinese crime lords because crime lords don't care about the morality of their product. In fact, they are able to sell certain products because they're illegal. Now, the imperial government of China does not like the rapid expansion of opium smokers in and around Canton. Who would? So they demand that the British stop trading in opium. And the British say, well, on the one hand, the people trading in opium are private citizens. They're not working for the government, so we really can't control them, which is baloney. They could if they wanted to. B, if you let us trade for other things besides silver, then there wouldn't be an incentive to import this drug into your society. So maybe if your policy changed, we would crack down on the opium smugglers, to which the Chinese said that's extortion, we're not doing it. Now, the Chinese send, the imperial government in Peking sends a new governor to Canton. His name is Lin Shay. Lin Shay is hardcore anti-drug, anti-opium. And he makes a point early in his regime of gathering up all the opium stocks he can find, bringing it to the docks right in front of the British legation, or in front of the British factories, and burning them in front of the British and in front of the people of Canton, demonstrating that the imperial government of China is back and is taking no prisoners. If you trade in opium, we will take your product and burn it. If we catch you, we will punish you, maybe with the death penalty. And a number of Chinese were executed for taking part in the opium trade. So Governor Lin is not messing around. The British go to war. In 1842, the Anglo-Chinese Opium War, the first Anglo-Chinese Opium War, is fought. The Chinese have big junks, which is a Chinese ship that's sort of like a supercog caravel galleon. It's very big compared to the European ships. Some of them have silk sails, and others have bamboo sails. They have some cannon on them, but they are big and slow and unmaneuverable. The Europeans have modern 19th century sailing frigates, a bit like the USS Constitution, which, if you know anything about sailing ships, is a wonderful ship. The British also have a paddle-wheel steam vessel, a warship. And that steam vessel doesn't have to worry about the wind or the tide. It can go where it wants as long as the water is deep enough. With modern weaponry, and including the steamships and the modern frigates, Governor Lin's forces are crushed. The imperial government of China is forced to fire Lin and grant Britain the island of Hong Kong. as a trading post that will be under British rule, not Chinese. As to the trade in opium, everyone understands that since the British beat the Chinese, that's going to continue. Now, is this shameful of the British to fight a war in order to be allowed, in order to not be stopped importing a narcotic, a heavily addictive narcotic to China, when China's government is trying to stop it? Yeah, absolutely it is. But the Chinese were also playing power politics too, and they refused to see the British as anything other than a bunch of round-eyed savages. This gets to one of the Chinese conceits. China is Zhengguo, the Middle Kingdom. It is Zhenghua, central flowery of culture. Throughout its thousands of years of history, without a dark age, China has been the bright light reflected by the Korean civilization. The Koreans adapt some Chinese ideas, they have some of their own, they make their own civilization, but the Chinese see it as an echo of theirs. The Japanese do the same thing. In fact, modern Japanese samurai clothing is absolutely based on Tang Dynasty China. So China looks around and it's accustomed to seeing itself as the center of the world, surrounded by a bunch of lesser peoples, lesser cultures, lesser states. And that disdain, that contempt, that arrogance is very much apparent in all of their diplomacy up to this time. But then the round-eyed barbarians prove that they are not an echo of China, and that they are not weaker than China. Now, China has been conquered by outsiders before, and the way that China deals with outsiders who conquer China is to absorb them. That's what happened with the Mongols. When Genghis Khan conquered China, he told his people, do not go into those cities except to rape and steal. If you go into those cities and start living there, your grandchildren will not be Mongols anymore. They will take your souls. And that's exactly what happened. The Mongols were absorbed, like the Manchus who came later to conquer China in the early 1600s, were absorbed, like countless other barbarian groups that had a military edge were absorbed. So what the Chinese believe at this point is that the Westerners might have a military advantage, and what we will do is allow the West to come in because we can't stop them, but we will absorb them. They had the confidence that their culture would absorb them. Quite the contrary happened. During the period after the 1842 Opium War, during the 50 years after the 1842 Opium War, more and more Chinese became westernized. The Christian faith begins to spread in China. Liberal ideas from Britain and other places in Europe begin to spread in China. Even socialism, in its own way, begins to spread in China. More and more Chinese are educated abroad. They come back to China with westernized ideas. And it becomes apparent that in the 1800s, it's not merely a matter of maritime superiority for the Europeans and a little bit of military edge. In the 1800s, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, China is backward, slow, and needy as compared to the industrial West. And more Chinese begin to see their own traditional culture as backward. No longer the center of the world. No longer the envy of the world. No longer the model that the world follows. Because when Europe arrives in China, the world has gotten much bigger than the typical pre-contact Chinese conception of themselves as the central flowery of culture. That pretense, though, is still very much there. And it's something the Chinese Communist Party is trying to use. Their narrative, spoiler alert, is that in the century of shame, which began with the Anglo-Chinese Opium War of 1842 and ended with the glorious People's Victory when China's civil war was ended with a communist triumph. During that century of shame, China was beaten and abused and shamed by the West. The Westerners had parks that had signs on them that said no dogs or Chinamen, and this is in China. Chinese became second-class citizens in their own country. And there's some truth to all of this. But being communists, they take that some truth and turn it into a big lie. They see themselves and they sell themselves to China's people as the great answer to the West, something that has made China strong again. Well, they made China the greatest charnel house for mass murderer in human history. They caused a lot of the poverty that they claim to have solved. They've gotten rich because the West has traded with them in the last 30 years. In any event, more and more Chinese begin to see the West as a problem like China has never faced before. And if the West is an outside culture that actually is so vibrant that Chinese are being absorbed by it, something needs to be done. Chinese nationalists who are rising, who are developing thoughts of how they're going to keep China Chinese, begin to say what we need to do, and this pattern is going to be done again and again in history, what we need to do is inoculate ourselves from the West. We need to inoculate ourselves from that Western virus. We need to come up with a, what do they call the COVID thing? A vaccine to prevent us from succumbing to Westernism, to Christianity, to liberalism, to free markets, to freedom in general. We need to preserve what is Chinese about China. And the way to do that is to take something Western into us, convert it to Chinese, and then use it to drive off the rest of the West. In that sense, it's very much like taking a bacillus into you and having your body learn to fight it so that you become immune to a particular virus or disease. So, in the 1860s, 70s, actually 50s, 60s, and 70s, something called the Taiping Rebellion erupts in central China. The Taiping Rebellion causes megadeath on a massive scale. It's one of the high points of violent death in human history. The Taiping Rebellion scares the Imperial Chinese government far more than the Westerners do at this point, because it's Chinese and it's Western. The Taiping Rebellion is led by a man who describes himself as Jesus Christ's younger brother. The Taiping are there to restore China with a Chinese variant of Christianity that is highly nationalistic, that is going to overthrow the backwards Chinese empire, the Qing dynasty, the Manchus, all of that, gone. And instead, a modern Christian China led by Jesus Christ's own younger brother, will take over. Now, as a Christian Westerner, I can tell you that the theology of the Taiping is barely recognizable as Christian. But what the Taiping purported to do was take that Western idea that is Christianity, that's at the heart of Western civilization, that really is the nucleus of Western civilization for the past 1,700 years, make it Chinese, and then allow it to revivify, revive the Chinese nation, the Chinese culture, the Chinese state, by adopting a Christian sensibility. China is going to be able to preserve the rest of its uniqueness. That's the idea. And it's a very powerful thing. It is so powerful that the Chinese government hires a series of Western generals, including Charles Gordon, who's later murdered by the whirling dervishes of the Mahdi in the Sudan in the 1880s. Charles Gordon, known as Chinese Gordon, is hired by the imperial government, along with a number of other Western military experts. And these Western military experts take sections of the imperial army, cull them of their best men, and then train them and drill them and equip them like a mid-1800s army in the United States or in Europe. And these modern Western armies are employed by the relatively backwards imperial Chinese government to suppress the Taiping, which is an actual modernizing force within China and claims to be Christian. The Taiping come very close to succeeding. But with the help of General Gordon and other westernized army units and Western leaders, The Taiping Rebellion is finally suppressed at great cost in human life and in widespread destruction. This is something known very little outside of China. It's a very important part of Chinese history that most people outside of China never even think about or hear about. So the Taiping Rebellion settles a few things. Number one, it demonstrates exactly how attractive, insidiously attractive from a Chinese national point of view, Western civilization can be. The Chinese have been playing this game that we are superior to the West and that ultimately the Westerners will be absorbed by us. You know human nature. You know that sometimes people, when faced with reality, go, no, 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 no. Because they don't want to hear it, they don't want to know it, they don't want to have to deal with it. They live in Egypt, the land of denial. And the Chinese imperial government, which has had in the Taiping absolute proof that China, to survive, will need to westernize to a degree, refuses to. Instead, in the year first of all, it has this point driven home even further. You see, the Japanese take the opposite tack when faced with Westerners. The Japanese determine, and I'll explain this more on Monday, that they will become more Western than the Westerners. They will become more Western than the Westerners. And by 1894, the Japanese have a British-style Navy, or they're building one. They have a German-style army, and they're developing one. And they feel strong enough to start expanding into Korea and into China's sphere of influence. And the Chinese go, no, we are the Middle Kingdom of Asia, little Japan. We will deal with you. And in the 1894 Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese get spanked. The Japanese run roughshod over them, and they start treating the Chinese the way chauvinistic Europeans are treating the Chinese, only worse, because they're fellow Asians. And being fellow Asians, they don't feel any need to play games with culture or nicety or diplomacy. They accepted Western ways so that they could remain Japanese. The Chinese refused Western ways so that they could remain Chinese. And one of these paths leads to destruction. Well, in the year 1900, China is ruled by the Dowager Empress Shili. The Dowager Empress is like the Queen Mother in England. She has been the wife and mother of a series of weak men Chinese emperors. And over the last few decades, she has accrued power. And because of the victory over the Taiping, her power is largely unchallenged in the year 1900. She makes a secret alliance with a group of martial arts societies. This is like something out of a Hong Kong chop sake movie from the 1970s with Bruce Lee. In fact, there is a Hong Kong chop sake movie from the 1970s with Bruce Lee that deals with this event. What the alliance between the Dowager Empress Shili and the martial arts societies is that they will rise up independently and spontaneously, that she will ensure that the imperial army doesn't do anything serious to stop them, and that they, with Chinese martial arts greatness, will drive out the round-eyed barbarians and return China to its pride and sovereignty and roots. This is literally a time when people put their lives on the line, believing that their Buddhist-style meditation, there is no bullet, there is no bullet, there is no bullet, will prevent a rifle bullet from a bolt-action rifle from killing them. What happens when the boxers, which are what they are called, because they're martial artists, the Westerners call them boxers. This is called the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. What happens when the boxers take over Peking, the capital of China, what we now call Beijing? Foreign legations are surrounded and besieged for 55 days. Meanwhile, Westerners are attacked all over China. Western mission houses are burnt. Western factories are destroyed. Western canals are damaged. Also, all over China, these fighting fists of glory and justice strike out for China, and the Imperial Army dithers because the Dowager Empress is secretly behind all of this. But like the Celts in ancient times found, wearing the blue woad of magical protection, which Celtic warriors sometimes wore, woad being a blue body paint with red clay spiking their hair, so that they were magically safe from harm, and they would become the gods' very own furies, charging into battle, buck naked, in blue body paint with red spiky hair, going, yeah, with their weapons. How did that fare against Romans' legions with steel body armor and ironclad discipline? The Celtic world was largely conquered. What happens when the fighting fists of justice, the Kung Fu and Wushu societies of traditional China, come together to fight the modern armies of the West? They fly and kick, and they die and kick. They fly and they die. This is what happens. There is no balance of power between the martial artists and the modern soldier. The Boxer Rebellion is a frickin' disaster for traditional China. The Dowager Empress is embarrassed, and she loses a lot of the power she still had, and the Westerners become even more emboldened to take over China. Now, China would have become like Africa or India, an area overtly conquered by Europe, turned into a series of separate colonies. The Europeans were getting ready to do this. The Japanese along with them, the Russians by land along with them. At this point, President Theodore Roosevelt and the United States step in. And we say, no, we do not want China carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. What we want is the open door policy. The open door policy advocated by the American President Roosevelt, a progressive Republican, if you can imagine such a thing, is that China will remain intact. Its imperial status, its nation status will be preserved. But that imperial status will allow a series of treaties with us to continue. Why should we settle for carving one part of China into our empire when we can, through treaties, have the entire country open to development, what Roosevelt calls development, what the Chinese nationalists would call foreign exploitation? With the open door policy, which is accepted by the Europeans and even the Russians and Japanese to an extent, even though they don't like it very much, but is particularly accepted by the Germans, the French, and the British, China's national unity is preserved. The illusion of imperial power is preserved. And this preservation is going to be, I think, good for China in the long run. But during this time of what are called the Unequal Treaties, the people of China are legally second-class citizens within their own land. No European or American or Japanese or Russian, depending upon what you want to call them, can be tried in a Chinese court. They have to be tried in courts of their own country, or at least Western courts. So, in effect, the foreigners, the foreign devils, the round-eyed barbarians, as we're called, are above the law. Chinese law can't touch them. Westerners can set up mission houses for Christianity any place they want, and they do. Westerners can set up factories anywhere they want, and they do. Westerners can build railroads and canals and port cities anywhere they want, and they do. The imperial government goes along with all of it because it has no ability to stop them. The Boxer Rebellion proved that. Heck, even the Austro-Hungarians were involved in suppressing the Boxer Rebellion. So it's what the communists today call the eight-power alliance. It was not an eight-power alliance. It was a temporary moment where the West came together to make sure that the Boxer Rebellion didn't kill all those Westerners in Peking or take over China. So China is now open. And where we will leave things, there is a wonderful movie and book called The Sand Pebbles. It's by Robert McKenna, who was a former American sailor in the China River Navy that America ran. America, like all of these foreign powers, as part of the Unequal Treaties, sent gunboats, which are basically river craft, not Navy warships, but gunboats, up China's rivers to protect their interests. These gunboats had troops on them, they had guns on them, and if there were any problems, what the gunboats would do is they would stop any local warlord who was making trouble, or they would help any local warlord that was willing to protect foreign interests. So American military forces and European military forces, Japanese and Russian military forces, all went deep into China, up its rivers, down its roads. They built its railroads, all with the purpose of protecting foreign interests. So I recommend that you see The Sand Pebbles if you want. It's set in the 1920s. During a time of increased Chinese nationalism, which we'll talk about next unit. But it does an incredible job of showing China in those days. Where we're going to leave things is, was China, in fact, victimized by the world during their so-called century of shame? The answer is yes. Unequal treaties, gunboats up Chinese rivers, Chinese being second-class citizen, that's all true. Part of the reason for this is that the imperial government of China refused to westernize in any significant way. They would hire Western mercenaries to come in and crush the Taiping, but that's about it. And then once the Western mercenaries were no longer needed, we have the Boxer Rebellion, an attempt to drive the Westerners out with traditional Chinese martial arts, which in retrospect is kind of ludicrous, or it's a sign of desperation. Where we leave things this unit, the open door policy is in effect. China, with the exception of the Russians in Manchuria and the Japanese in Korea, the Chinese nation is not being carved up with those two exceptions. However, China is at its weakest point relative to the outside world, arguably in its history. Arguably because of the cultural inferiority of a pre-industrial Chinese culture that refuses to fundamentally change versus modern European industrial cultures, it is the weakest moment in the entire history of China. Monday, we will go to Japan. Thank you for your time. Have a good day and a good weekend. You need not make comments on this video.